Welcome to Zero Knowledge. I'm your host, Anna Rose. In this podcast, we will be exploring the latest in zero-knowledge research and the decentralized web, as well as new paradigms that promise to change the way we interact and transact online. This week, Nico and I chat with Andrew and Vivek from Cursive. We catch up with them about what led them to start working on a series of activations and experiments using programmable cryptography. We map out the timeline of these activations. Often they were part of in-person events, including events like ZK Summit 11 and ZK Summit 12 last year. They walk us through some of the challenges and also insights they had as they speedran the deployment of experimental applications using experimental libraries with real users. Cursive is one of the teams I feel are on the edge of the application development front in ZK and in the adjacent fields like MPC and FHE, and they've been working on some concepts that I think could be quite powerful in the future. Concepts like passively sharing digital signals from private user devices, or what they call digital pheromones, as well as the idea of narrowcasting. Nico and I have actually mentioned these concepts before on the show, so it was great to get a chance to catch up with the team who invented them. Now, before we kick off this episode, I want to share a few things from our ecosystem. First, if you haven't seen it yet, ZK Summit 13 is happening in Toronto on May 12th. Applications to attend just opened. Space is more limited than usual this time around, as our venue caps out at around 400, so we are encouraging people who really want to join to get their spot secured early. It is invite only, and we do prioritize previous attendees and long-term members of the ZK community. So if you're newer and you really want to join, just aim to apply early for a better chance of getting a spot. The application to speak can be found in the same form. The deadline to apply to speak is March 15th. Next up on the ZK Hack front, if you don't know, ZK Hack is a hub for learning about ZK. If you're just getting into the space, this would be a really good place to check out. One of our projects there, the ZK Whiteboard sessions, just wrapped up. We released our final 2 modules in the past month. These were hosted by Dan Bonnet. They were focused on Fry and proximity proofs. We also completed our first study group that went through these videos kind of in detail, but we are looking to launch a new one in the coming months focused just on these Fry modules. So if that's interesting for you, be sure to head over to the ZK Hack Discord. I'll add the link to that in the show notes. That's where we organize the study groups. I also just want to mention that ZK Hack Seoul has been unfortunately postponed. We weren't able to secure the venue that we needed, and so we've decided not to do the event this year. In the meantime, though, we are hosting ZK Hack meetups in Sofia around the ZK Proofs event and in Denver right around the ETH Denver event. We are also developing our next hackathon. It will probably be in Berlin in June around the Protocolberg and DAppCon events. We'll be sharing more over on the ZK Hack channels in the lead up to that. So I think that wraps up all the upcoming events. Hope to see you at some of these. Now, here's our episode with Andrew and Vivek from Cursive. Today, Nico and I are here with Vivek and Andrew from Cursive. Welcome, both of you, to the show.
Excited to be here.
Longtime ZK podcast fanboy.
Oh, I'm so glad. Nico, thanks for joining.
Hello, hello.
This episode is a long time coming. We've actually been trying to schedule it for the last 2 months or so. Nico, you and I, we did an episode back in October where we talked a little bit about some of the Cursive activations and experiments. And then in our end of year episode, we also mentioned what you guys had been up to. So yeah, it's so good to have you on so we can actually dig in to, all of these events that you've been present at and what you're thinking in terms of using programmable cryptography in the real world. So let's kick off with a little backstory on the two of you. Where did you get your start? What got you excited about this? And maybe at what point did your paths start to merge? Vivek, let's start with you.
Yeah, so back in 2016 was the first time I started doing cryptography work. I was part of this research program at MIT where I was paired with some grad students to work on computer science projects, and they just randomly slotted me into cryptography. And I started out doing some stuff with consensus alternatives like proof of space, so very crypto economic, but involved cryptography, Merkle trees. And then I did some authenticated dictionary work with Aline Tomescu, who I think has actually been a guest on the show as well.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
So we worked together for 2-3 years using KZG commitments for authenticated dictionaries, and then kind of just dropped off cryptography for a while because I kind of thought, I don't want to be an academic, and everything in industry seems like it's weird crypto scams or something. Like it was like during like NFT craze.
Oh.
And I like briefly interned at like a crypto trading firm, and I was like, this is degeneracy. I don't want to do this.
Crypto is scary and weird. That is true.
Absolutely. And back then
I
it
had
was like
the exact
scarier.
same process when I
Amazing.
studied cryptography, and then it was like, I can't get into all this crypto scam nonsense.
Yeah.
Like I have to work somewhere else.
No, exactly. And then I did like machine learning research for a few years at MIT. And then near the end of graduation, one of my best friends, Ayush, who's also been a guest on the show, he's like good friends with Brian Gu, the founder of Xerox PARC. I think they go back to like high school.
Okay.
And he told me they were spinning up this new lab. They're doing this like weird ZK thing. And I was like, what is this? Like, it's probably another crypto scam. And then I started reading the Vitalik blog posts, and I was like, oh my God, this is like KZG commitments. Like this is the same stuff I was doing. It's just like applied in a different way. And so, yeah, I basically started with them in like late 2021, early 2022, doing some initial experiments around anonymous speech.
Nice. So that was Xerox PARC. What were you helping out? Did you join them as an employee, or were you just kind of learning along? Were you kind of a resident? I actually don't know how it was structured back then.
Early on, I think it was structured very similar to PSC in that it was essentially like giving out a bunch of grants. A lot of them were like Brian's ideas for various projects he wanted to see, including the stuff that I was working on. Like anonymous speech was something that he was championing for a while.
Okay.
So I was just a grantee there for about a year. And then I was briefly a full-time employee working on ZooPass.
Were you there during like the Dark Forest era, or did you join after that?
No, I was not. I like knew it was happening.
Yeah.
I'd like known Brian from some other programs, and I knew they were working on it, but I was not involved with Dark Forest.
Okay. And what about you, Andrew? How did you get your start?
I guess I had a less involved past with cryptography. I never studied cryptography in college, but one of my friends from doing math together kind of reminded me that programmable cryptography existed. He's basically like, oh, this ZK thing is really cool. You should go check it out. And I was completely fascinated. This was maybe in 2023.
Okay.
In springtime.
Yeah.
So quite recent, actually. And I got into it purely from the math side. I was like, this is completely magical. The idea that you can prove things without revealing any extra information is completely absurd, and it makes no sense. And the fact that it's just built on algebraic objects and numbers is incredible. So that's kind of what drew me in at the beginning. And after a little while, I was like, okay, this is really cool. I want to work on this for a little while. Let me go meet some people in the space. First, I joined a PSE project for a few months. I was working on identity wallets for a bit based on zero knowledge proofs. And then afterwards, I went to meet a bunch of people who were working in ZK. I met Lakshman from Persone. I don't know if he's been on the show, but Lakshman and I had a conversation where we were talking about how ZK enables people to express themselves differently, how it can be connected to identity in the physical world. One cool concept we toyed around with was the idea of being able to change an outfit or wear different pieces of clothing and basically become a different person, have different identity personas. And from that, Lakshman was like, okay, I know someone else who has similar thoughts or is thinking in similar directions. And that's when he introduced me to Vivek, and we've been working together since then.
Oh, cool. Vivek, you were doing ZooPass. You sort of just mentioned that. This is Zuzalu ZooPass?
Yep, same one.
So I guess, did you guys meet after that?
Yeah, so I was working on the ZooPass team. And actually, I think where Cursive like properly started was at Zuzalu. So there I met Rachel, who's like currently like one of the co-founders and like our head of design. She had been working at PSC for a few years, like helping with design for a bunch of projects there. And I also met Althea, who was like a core member of our team during the early stages, like also kind of a design and like comms background. And so like it was near the end of Zuzalu where we all kind of met and built out kind of an initial NFC experiment using like signatures and NFC cards, which we can get more into in a bit. And then I think that was like May 2023, and I met Andrew like July 2023 over video call. I actually, when I first called Andrew, I thought he like thought what we were doing was really boring. Like I was like, oh, I don't think I'm ever going to talk to him again. That's unfortunate. But then he reached out again, and I was like, oh, okay, cool, nice. Let's do something.
Did you find it boring, Andrew?
No, I thought it was awesome. Otherwise, I probably would not have reached out again. That's hilarious. I didn't know that.
That's cool.
You also had long hair. I never actually saw long hair Andrew in person. I just saw it over that one.
I did have really long hair.
One video call.
There's very few people in the ZK space who have seen that rare version.
Before we dive into Cursive, because that's kind of what I want to cover primarily in this episode, Cursive and the experiments you've run, I don't know if we've ever talked about ZooPass on the show, and it might be worth it to talk a little bit about what that was, because, yeah, this is like at Zuzalu, that 2-month pop-up city, kind of the first one that prompted, I mean, since then there's been lots of variations and you know, I think there's new Zuzalus in different places, but yeah, there was this ZooPass. So maybe tell us a little bit about what that was.
Yeah, definitely. So I was one of the first 2 devs on the team, and I was there for sort of like roughly the founding of it. I would not call myself a founder, but like I was basically just like hanging out with Brian around the time when he was coming up with the concept for ZooPass. And he was like, do you want to work on this? And I was like, yeah, let's do it. And yeah, I mean, I would say it's basically an identity wallet that I think its innovation, as far as I can understand, is like they targeted a specific in-person event and also one that was very friendly to trying out new technologies. Yeah, we're able to sort of like digitize a bunch of various like tickets that were involved with events and like other kind of like data for citizens of Zuzalu or other sort of like pop-up cities. Yeah, and I think in the past year and a half, I haven't followed their work super closely, so I'm probably missing some details, but I think there's been a bunch of innovations on like data format and like ways of using ZooPass more easily as a developer. So they're just continuing to like, I think, make it easier to use ZK kind of friendly data and develop with it.
Yeah, I think I had it. I mean, it was kind of used as, I think you actually needed to get it for your initial ticket to like get in or something. I mean, I think there's maybe ways around it, but it was pretty integrated into the experience. I also know that I lost it at some point. Then for Dev Connect, you needed it again. But there was a way to do that. So I was able to get it back, which I don't actually know how that worked under the hood, but
it's actually something that we would love to talk about more. But with a lot of this stuff that you have like true ownership over, it's actually like a very fragile system because you need to remember, in the case of ZK data, it's less of like a signature private key, but more of like an encryption private key, which is usually derived from a master password. And if you forget that, you're kind of just screwed. You just like cannot recover your data. And so, yeah, it's pretty interesting. Like these systems can be a lot more fragile because there isn't really easy data recovery.
So I guess, is this a good time to ask, what is Cursive?
Yeah.
Yeah. We are a team that is exploring new ways for humans to discover and deepen their connections. So we want to make experiences that align with user empowerment. We believe that users should have control of their experience. And we think programmable cryptography is a really cool toolkit for enabling this, giving users ownership of their data, giving a lot more choice over what types of front ends and applications that they might actually be able to use, enabling new ways for them to express their identity. And ultimately, this is all in the aim of connecting people and bringing them together.
Is Cursive like a lab? Is it a company? Do you have a product? I feel like this is something you've actually probably heard a couple people ask. I think I might have asked you this a couple times too, but yeah, what is Cursive exactly?
I think we're currently transitioning from closer to an R&D lab to more of just like a product team. I think like we have a lot of good lessons on the research front and like what is kind of possible and, you know, more difficult with cryptography. So I think 2025 will definitely be a very like product driven year for us.
Cool.
We were in a very interesting position to begin with because I think we had a lot of product oriented thinking in our team, But at the same time, a lot of the technologies that we wanted to explore and use simply were not ready or were not packaged into user-facing form. And so we had to spend a lot of time not only iterating on the product side, but also just fundamentally seeing what is possible, what can be done with these tools. So in a way, we were forced to do both, but I think we took a lot of really good learnings from that.
Nice.
I wanted to ask, what's your approach to designing these products, right? I've seen a lot of teams who fall in love with the technology and say, like, this is great, I want to use it. And I get a sense that you guys do it the other way around, right?
I mean, I think there's a healthy amount of that as well. Like, I think Andrew and I definitely get nerd sniped and like just want to figure out new ways of using stuff. We think a lot about constraints in our process, and a lot of this is spearheaded by like our head of design, Rachel. Like, just creativity really, I think, is easier to access when you give yourself a box to work within instead of being like, the sky's the limit. I think one of those constraints is like around like human connection and data ownership. Like, what are sort of the existing problems with systems that we have right now? And in what ways does cryptography help? In what ways does it make the UX bad? Like, I think we're also very honest as a team and very pragmatic. I think we understand that like it would be lovely to have the purest system with like, like trustless or something close to that. But I think often that just needs to be balanced with like what users care about and like how good the experience can be. So yeah, I think that's been the kind of the process in the past. I think moving forward, we're looking to be a lot more user-centric, just like focusing on a specific persona, like kind of more traditional startup stuff, given all the knowledge we've acquired on different cryptographic tech, and progress that way. But that's a little bit more new. And I think is going to be like a 2025 focus.
Yeah, I think in the early stages of any new technology, if you want to be both on the cutting edge and also build things for consumers, there is sort of this dialectic between product and technology, right? You build some things, you give it to users, you see how they feel, but at the same time, you have to turn to the technology and say, oh, can we build this? And also, what else can we build? And this new thing, like, do people want that? So I think it's difficult in the early stages to be too much in one or the other, but slowly that'll change.
Let's do a rundown of the experiments that you did in the last year and a half or so. And then, so yeah, because I'm really curious to see kind of like what you learned maybe with each one. Did you do something after Zuzalu once Cursive was founded before DevConnect, or was DevConnect sort of the first time that you guys went out as Cursive?
Actually, I think at DevConnect, we weren't even properly called Cursive, but it was the same
you
kind
weren't?
of
Okay.
team. I think Cursive itself was launched at Denver.
Okay.
But there was some experiments in between there. We'll just quickly run through 2023 stuff.
Yep.
And then pass off to Andrew for 2024. So at Zuzalu, basically we did a really simple experiment with NFC cards where there wasn't even any ZK involved, but you could basically collect like kind of like a private POAP where an NFC card had its own private key and it would produce like unique signatures upon every tap. And so you could basically assign an NFC card to a specific event at Zuzalu, like let's say attending a town hall. And people who tapped that would essentially get this unique signature. It would be stored privately in their ZooPass. And then theoretically, they could use it later, to prove they attended, either just with the signature itself or using a ZK wrapper. We didn't actually get around to doing the ZK step. It was mostly just like kind of maybe more on the side of like verifiable credentials than like zero knowledge proofs. But yeah, I think we just wanted to create more data for people to make ZKPs with. That was kind of the problem we identified during different workshops with Rachel and Althea of like, yeah, this tech is cool, but like no one can use it because like there was like ZK email and TLS notary vaguely existed, but it was too hard to use those. So you couldn't make proofs about anything.
I guess it's also on your side laying the groundworks for what's to come next, right? Like all the infrastructure that you guys are going to reuse.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like once people have a little supply of signatures, you can start to, do a lot more fun stuff with that. Yeah. So that was that. And I think like the next step was basically adding these signatures. And so this came around, like late 2023. This is also when Andrew joined the team, which was an amazing level up for us. Oh my God. Like we were just suddenly able to do so much more because Andrew is a force of nature. Yeah, basically we experimented with this concept called quests, which is basically like a user-friendly wrapper of ZK proofs. So essentially, like we create a quest, which was, I think the best example was like, oh, to attend this event, you need to meet like 3 out of 5 of the organizers. So the idea here being like, instead of there being like a fixed invite list, it was just sort of proof of knowing the people involved.
Cool.
And instead of calling it a ZK proof, we wanted to experiment with different terminology and wrap it better, just so you didn't need to be a ZK person to like get it. And I think that was like a really fun experiment. I think we did a lot of interesting things like event invites and scavenger hunts. And we also iterated this at ETH Denver, just a much larger version of this in collaboration with IYK, like another NFC team. The main takeaway from that, though, is that ZK felt like a little bit of a limiting toolkit in order to build like full user-facing applications around, in that like a lot of what you can do is roughly like privacy-preserving access control. You can basically like prove you meet some threshold and then get access to something. And it turns out like this often kind of just looks like tickets or like gating some like online content. And I think we felt a little bit limited by having that be our only kind of cryptographic tool, which led to like a lot of future facing experiments at like ZK11 and onwards.
Cool. At DevConnect, it was that where you were actually doing those like you must know 3 out of 5 of the organizer type experiments?
Yep. We ran a few of them for different like parties and events.
Cool. I was not aware and sadly didn't go to any of these. I did not know 3 out of 5 of these organizers, clearly.
I guess so. Yeah, we had like 200 cards produced. It was actually quite a fun sprint. Like we basically were able to add baby jub curves into these cards. Like, so basically they're Java cards, so you code them with like kind of jank Java, like not full Java, like partial Java. And we were able to get some valid signatures going. And so we were able to build a full ZK experience around it. And yeah, there are only 200 of them. So I think it was like kind of hard to get it to everybody.
It's okay. I forgive. Just kidding. It was a big event. No worries. But it sounds cool. I'm kind of sad I missed that part. Let's fast forward then to ETH Denver 2024. Because, I mean, I really got to know what you guys were doing at ZK11, which was April. So just like a month or two after ETH Denver. What had you actually done at ETH Denver?
Yeah, I think 2 different things. I would say the main experience that was available to every attendee was related to completing these ZK quests, proving that you met certain people, that you went to certain events or had certain experiences, and being able to claim prizes as a result of that. But at the same time, we were also working on new experiments specifically related to private set intersection. And this was using a BFV library in collaboration with Janujaya, who's a longtime collaborator of ours. And I think what we've noticed is from all these activations and all these experiments, it takes a while to take a new technology in programmable cryptography and actually be able to productionize it successfully. So at Denver, we first played around with this BFV PSI toolkit, and Vivek spent multiple all-nighters trying to get it to work while we were building out the main app experience as well. And I think we were able to make a proof of concept, but there were still some discontinuities in the experience. And fast forward to ZK11, that's when we actually were able to deploy it successfully, and it basically worked perfectly during the event.
Nice.
And we've noticed,
it really did.
Yeah, that the lessons we learned from trying to get it to work and it struggling to work, those carried over, and eventually we did actually like do it successfully. But at the same time, at ZK11, we wanted to also experiment with folding, specifically regards to being able to prove you met multiple people, each one of those being an individual proof, but being able to fold that together into some sort of Spotify wrapped-like experience for your whole ZK11 journey. These were all the people I met. These were all the speakers I met, and kind of generate one big folding proof related to that. And we didn't learn our lesson at all. Deploying technology for the first time still is a huge trouble. Specifically with regards to folding, we ran into issues with key sizes, basically having to download very large keys. And you can imagine like trying to get, I don't know, what was it, like 300 attendees, 400, maybe more.
There's 550.
Okay. Great.
ZK11.
Cool.
Yeah. 550 attendees to download like tens of megabytes of like keys on conference.
Everyone
internet.
on the same Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
I don't know if everyone did it in ZK11. I feel like it was the first time we worked together, and we did announce it at the beginning of the event, but a lot of the community weren't used to it. By ZK12, I think the percentage of attendees using it was actually up.
Yeah.
But yeah.
But I do want to touch
Definitely.
more on the PSI or private set intersection experience, because I think this was something that we learned that was actually quite successful. So specifically what this allowed you to do is you have a list of all the people that you've met at the conference. These are represented by their signatures from their public keys, rather. You have a list of interests or things that you're interested in. And when you meet someone, you can basically privately figure out what you have in common. And at ZK11, we found that a lot of people were really interested in trying this out. It got received pretty well at the event, and people were like, oh my God, like I can actually meet someone new, connect with them instantly, and all my data stays on my device and it's all private. So I think that was a really good learning from that event, that even something pretty small like PSI, it seems like a very simple primitive, can be quite expressive. And contrast that with heavier things like full-on FHE, like let's say you want to do FHEML or something. This is quite complicated to run. This takes a lot of computation and a lot of memory, and it's quite impractical for a lot of day-to-day consumer experiences. In contrast, something like PSI is already practical today. It works on your mobile browser, and it can actually create new social dynamics. So I think that was a very important learning for us.
I think like one other meta point here is like, this is our first time trying like multi-party stuff where you took data from like multiple people and did some computation. ZK is inherently a very single player endeavor. There's like a verifier, obviously. So it's kind of a multi-party computation. I think some people would get angry at that. But like the person with private data there's only one of them. Yeah. The ZK11 experience opened a lot of new doors in terms of like, okay, cool. Like, what are the new social dynamics we can explore when multiple people have private data involved? And it's a much less explored design space than ZK. So that's one meta point. And just building off the other thing that Andrew said, like, yeah, I think like a repeated lesson or like kind of a repeated pattern for us is like, we very ambitiously try to do some new technology at event like X. Yeah. We like completely fail. It like blows up. Like Andrew did mention, like for Denver, like we tried putting in like the private set intersection. It literally like broke the entire app. Aww. Mind you, we have like 12,000 NFC cards that we're giving out like in 5 hours.
Oh my God.
It broke it, the night before.
Oh,
it
was 2 a.m. Oh, no. It was 2 a.m. We were doing some last minute tests before we went to bed. And then it just totally broke everything. Aww. And so we had to like revert the commit, clean up a bunch of stuff, test another few hours.
The moment on your face when you realize, there's no sleep for me tonight.
Oh, no. I love the term programmable cryptography because it makes you forget how hard it is to program this stuff.
Oh, yeah. That's, honestly, it's true. It makes it seem a little too easy. But I think now we have a good awareness of like push to try to get it for an event, but like don't be too sad if it doesn't work out. It'll probably work out for the next one. And just a word of advice that like this stuff always takes longer than you think it will, especially if you're the first person like actually getting into the weeds of this stuff and trying to put it on like a mobile phone or a consumer device.
Yeah. It's great to see like your cryptographic like palette sort of expanding, but at the same time you're helping everyone else, right? Because now that you guys have tried this, someone else can come in and try like more PSI stuff.
Yeah, totally. That's definitely, I think, one of my favorite parts of the field is how open source friendly it is, like how much of a collaboration it all feels like. we're all just kind of like one big happy family, like, you know, at least some corners.
Some siblings bicker, but
Yeah,
it's a big family.
It's a big family. Like everyone's building off each other. And I really like that. Like it comes in contrast to like ML, for example, which is like a lot of closed source work happening. And then you see like DeepSeek come out and everyone's like, this is such a gift to mankind. And it's like, well, yeah, we've just been doing that in cryptography land.
Yeah, I think in programmable cryptography, a lot of people understand that siblings might fight, but we're all fighting a much bigger battle in the grand scheme of things. Like people are either going to adopt this stuff or they're not. And it's going to take a lot of effort to make it happen. There's a lot of inertia. And so I think it really is important for teams to collaborate and understand that either everyone wins or no one wins.
There is one thing I wanted to bring back about the way you did PSI. So PSI has sort of a history and literature of being a pure like two-party thing. Like you have two parties finding an intersection. And I think in your case, you guys did something quite interesting where you had like a server helping users compute their PSI. Could you tell us a bit more about how that worked?
Yeah, for sure. Essentially what we did was probably a little bit too overpowered of a technique, but it like works pretty nicely for our use case, which is multi-party FHE or like threshold FHE. So what goes on here is like, in this case, it's two parties. So let's say like me and Andrew are doing a private set intersection. We essentially like together perform an initial MPC where we create like a shared public key. So between us, we can see the public key, but neither of us knows the corresponding private key. It's kind of like a split between us. And so with this public key, what we can do is we can encrypt our data fully homomorphically to the shared public key. So now me and Andrew have like encrypted versions of our two sets of contacts, interests, whatever. And so now what we can do is we can run a comparison in FHE. And like usually this is actually like a very, you know, costly operation. So the nice thing here is you can like offload it to a server in a way that doesn't actually leak any privacy. The server is essentially just doing a bunch of like FFTs for you and then gives you back the encrypted result. And then at the end, me and Andrew come together and we do a decryption MPC, where essentially we decrypt the result of this computation without ever actually surfacing the kind of shared private key. We just decrypt it and thus only get the result of the computation. And this technique works for stuff past private set intersections. You can like do any computation with this method.
But you relieve sort of the user devices from the heavy workload.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's what I found super interesting.
Yeah, like essentially the user is just responsible for encrypting and creating this shared public key, which tend to be very light operations in general. And so, yeah, you basically do the setup and then a server just handles all the heavy lifting.
And also, when we started exploring PSI, we didn't have a good sense of whether or not PSI was going to be the main thing that provided a lot of application-facing value. So I believe that a lot of the tailor-made PSI schemes are specifically useful for private set intersection, but using multi-party FHE gave us the flexibility to say, oh, maybe we can play around with different types of primitives here as well. And maybe we can expand this to different things if they prove to be valuable.
Yeah. I think another shout out here to John Majaya. Again, like without him, like none of this would be possible. Specifically, he has a really great toolkit called Phantom Zone. It's like an MIT licensed FHE VM, different licensing to other sort of FHE tooling. And it basically is focused on this multi-party FHE techniques. So would highly recommend any devs to check that out. Really cool library. Can definitely build some fun stuff with it.
I remember when you first approached me for ZK11, I want to say like I was really excited about the ZK, the fact that there'd be kind of like a tool on site, but I was also a little bit wary because in my like in the past, long before I met you, I had sort of seen a lot of these experiments go very, very wrong at events. And when you're running an event, obviously you're under a lot of pressure in general. You want to make sure that anything that you're bringing will add to the experience of the participants. So I already knew you, Vivek. And I guess that maybe is why I took that chance. But I remember after the event being so happy that we had. But it really was unlike I really didn't know what to expect going into it. And so obviously when we started speaking again about ZK12, I was like very, very excited to work together again. I know that between ZK11 and ZK12, there was another experiment that you ran though. So let's talk a little bit about that, Frontiers.
Yeah, I'll step in real quick and not assuage any of your fears. Maybe you didn't know this, but so quick shout out. We also worked with Jack and Ian from Mach 34. They work on a bunch of ZK programmable cryptography tools as well. They helped us integrate folding into the ZK11 experience. And at the end of the day, like folding worked end to end. It just was like very poorly performing due to key sizes during the actual event. We got it working in production 20 minutes before the event started.
That totally does terrify me. You never told me that.
I probably should not have told you that, but now you know.
Amazing.
Things come down to the wire.
Wow.
One last ZK11 anecdote for me is how 1 hour before the end, Anna realizes that not only is there like all this cool ZK and PA side functionality, there's a leaderboard.
Yeah, that's true.
And so suddenly Anna is like, I cannot lose at my own event. So she's running around tapping everyone's cards.
Right.
And I think you won, right?
I did win in ZK11. I wasn't just that I cannot lose my own event. I think it was just that I realized that no one was ranking, no one was competing. Right. And so I started to get into it. For ZK12, we did fix that by actually offering incentives and bringing back the concept of prizes, which you had at ETH Denver, and we didn't think of for ZK11. But I know, let's talk about that in-between experiment with Frontiers and this hiring experiment, because I thought of that as, like, when we started talking about ZK12, you were telling me about this. It was so, I mean, it seems like such a cool use of this, of exactly these tools that you're working with. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, there's actually a really nice tie-in here with ZK11, which is that Frontiers is like a Paradigm sponsored event. It's like focused on open source Rust and Ethereum applications. And Georgios is like the main curator of that event. And
nice.
He actually first saw our technology at ZK11. And that's why he reached out. He reached out in our public channel. He was like, let's do something. And then we were like, sure. Not really expecting it to go anywhere, but ended up being a really good collaboration. And so also appreciate you, Nico, like digging a bit deeper into multi-party FHE, because that comes into play actually a lot more in this activation. So specifically, we wanted to take that toolkit we were using for just private set intersection, and we wanted to expand it to like a more general purpose function. And this is right around the time where Janmajaya opened up Phantom Zone as like a full, I guess not a full VM, it's closer to a circuit builder, where you could just write more general purpose multi-party FHE code. And so we basically were looking into matching as like a core verb or core action of like, how can we match people together based on private information in a way that like is more efficient or gets to use kind of like more data about people. And in the context of like a professional event like Frontiers, we kind of stumbled into hiring as an interesting example. I think there's two main interesting private information like pieces here. The first is like salary. So as a recruiter, there's some like usually like upper bound of salary or like ideally want to pay somebody. And as an employee, there's some lower bound that you're like willing to work for and you'd be excited to work for. And so like discovering overlap there without having to give up that information, we thought could be really interesting. So instead of there being like a lengthy negotiation and potentially even just figuring out later in the process that this isn't going to pay it's not enough, basically, you can sort of like front load that without actually giving up the information. And the second bit of privacy that I think is useful is like, as a job candidate, if you are already employed somewhere, but maybe like, are trying to figure out what else is out there, or maybe are unhappy with your job and like want to, start applying other places, you can't just post on LinkedIn, like, I hate my job, like, get me out of here. And so we were thinking, like it could be interesting to basically like privately attest to the fact that you're looking for new jobs, but you only get notified of jobs that kind of match your ideal circumstances. So you can kind of like, it's almost like manifesting in a way. You're like kind of like manifesting your ideal job, like the salary you want, the people you want to work with, and you're just putting it out there. And only if there is kind of a match on those characteristics do you ever get notified. And yeah, we ship this end to end using the same exact scheme where this sort of like heavy lifting of this computation is done on a server. The users are just responsible for encrypting their data. And yeah, it was like successful. I think like I got a few like, okay, I put in a fake like application because, you know, I'm happy at Cursive, but I wanted to test out the feature. So
It's like the job market catfish.
I think exactly. Which actually raises an interesting point around verifiability that we can get into. But for now, I basically put myself as like the like ideal candidate, like willing to work for like 10,000 a year, like willing to work like 60 hours a week, you know, like just the most ridiculous ends of each of these spectrums so I could ensure some matches. And yeah, I got some job offers, you know, or like not offers, but like some things that matched. And so, yeah, that was a really fun experiment. I think exploring, what you could do with a bit more than just like.
This like you're really replacing the recruiter here too. Like usually you have a quote unquote trusted third party who has all of this information. That recruiter will know that you're looking, but your employer doesn't know. They'll know often your salary bounds, but like the potential hiring company won't really know exactly what your range is. And this is sort of like directly bringing the two parties together in that private way where they can find each other. That's so cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I think this comes up a lot in our explorations as like a lot of this stuff just tends to be much more direct with the consumer and you can cut out the middlemen. And it was interesting, like there's a tension here where we talked to some of the recruiters at the event about like what they thought about it. And in some ways it's like, well, you're kind of doing our job. You know, it's like in some ways it's like kind of, not synergistic. But I think one positive framing that one of the recruiters found is like, actually it's nice because someone like Georgios can just put out a private job description and he himself can match with really good people instead of there needing to be kind of like a middleman. And I think you can actually create an experience that's like a little bit less kind of extractive or kind of, I don't know, like clearly there's a bunch of like recruiter sharks coming around trying to hire people. It's less of headhunting and more just like peer-to-peer discovery of good overlap. And it can just be done directly between engineers. Yeah, it's interesting. There's like positive and like negative framings for recruiters.
In this experience, was there also like a communication feature where people could actually send something through this? Or was it just the matching and then they had to kind of find each other elsewhere?
I think we just like, once you match, you just got their Telegram or their email. Like you could just choose how you wanted to be contacted and then you could just reach out on those platforms.
Okay. But is this still like you're going up to somebody and like tapping a card? Are you connecting? Are you standing in front of the person when you realize it's a match? Or is it like there's a pool of people and you're getting matched kind of willy-nilly?
Yeah. In this experiment, you actually had to go up and tap people and build your own social graph. And I think the idea there was that if you met people in person, you would be able to talk with them, have sort of a deeper relationship, and it would be more of a warm referral. I think this relates to the question of data import, which is a big question we spend a lot of time thinking about in our work, because a lot of these matching experiments work well when there's really rich data available about the people who are getting matched. And so in this case, the data here is the social graph, as well as the form inputs for your hiring preferences. And you could imagine that in an experiment outside of a conference, you could get this social graph through other means, be it maybe like ZK email from your calendar invites, ZK TLS from maybe your LinkedIn connections. You could find other ways to import this data. And you could also perhaps do that with job searches. You could import data about where you worked in the past, for example, and have that be filled in automatically. And so I think being able to easily import data is a question that's very relevant to making this experience richer for matching. And it's something that we have to spend a lot of time getting the UX right, because people filling out forms and having to manually meet people in person to build that social graph, that's not going to be the long-term solution. And so still an open question.
And it kind of addresses the catfishing concerns, right? Like if you have verifiable sources of data.
Yeah, definitely.
I was curious, was this whole experiment still built on PSI only? Or did you need other primitives in there?
Yeah, so we actually basically just wrote a full Boolean circuit. Specifically under the hood, it's using few, FHEW, which kind of takes like Boolean circuits as input. The main kind of new functionality we needed was a comparator, like a greater than, because we wanted to compare the recruiter's salary upper bound with like the candidate's lower bound. And everything else ended up just being like a bunch of ands and ors and stuff. Like, you know, is there overlap on a experience level? Like, I only want to hire people with like a bachelor's or higher, and just making sure that like take the and of that bit vector and the candidate's bit vector is there like overlap basically.
Cool. So I just remember when we were talking about the ZK12 activation, we had actually thought a bit about this hiring experiment as maybe also something we could run there. We decided against it. I remember us kind of going over a few iterations of what could we get out of this moment with these people? What can they get out of that as well? Like where would they get a kick out of this? I think what we ended up landing on was having sort of preferences again, because in ZK11, I just remember it being like number of talks and number of contacts. At ZK12, we actually had something more like, what are you into? What do you like? What do you not like? Or I think the question was, which of these are overrated? But people got confused on the scale. Right. Was like, was 3 overrated or was 1 overrated? So everyone got a little bit confused how to vote for it, which led to some great conversations. Yep. I thought.
That's on me.
But yeah, but maybe share a little bit about how this differed. What were you using for this?
I think ZK12 for us was more of an ideological progression. I think in the actual app experience, we did do more of these hot takes, finding more rich ways for people to actually connect with each other based on more meaningful data. I think what we realized is the questions you ask people and what they're responding to really matters. You want two people to be able to meet each other, and when they learn each other's preferences, actually be like, oh, that's cool. This is a conversation now, or I'm really excited. Why do you think this? So I think we learned a lot in that direction. But more specifically, we kind of had 2 new concepts that we were playing around with, which were just framings of things we had already done, specifically digital pheromones and narrowcasting. And narrowcasting also being relevant to Trinity, which was a new MPC scheme that we were looking into at the time. Maybe I can talk a little bit about digital pheromones, and Vivek, you can take narrowcasting with Trinity. For us, we were thinking about, okay, like what is actually going on here? We have this ability to match multiple people on private information, sort of build more meaningful connection through these interactions. How can we describe what is happening here? And I think what we ended up on is this idea called digital pheromones, specifically pheromones being these discrete chemical signals that you're constantly sending out in search of human compatibility or a mate or whatever it might be. And digital pheromones are the digital equivalent. So they can be applied to many different settings. It could be online dating, could be private hiring. But crucially, what ties this all together is the idea that they are private and safe. So when I have like my physical pheromones, like this is not something that I'm just yelling out or screaming into public space. These are much more discreet, and these are things where, okay, when you actually interact with me, then they get surfaced in passive ways. And I think digital pheromones is kind of a similar concept where these are all private signals. They're all based on potentially sensitive data that remains private to you. But the only time you actually realize something is going on is if you are connected with someone, or if you do meet someone that matches your signals. And so I think we thought this was really cool, because now there's this way for people to just be walking around, going about their daily life, potentially walking around a conference or event, just doing what they are normally planning on doing. But behind the scenes, all this matching is going on and all this compatibility and connection is being found, but none of it is explicit. None of it is being done on a big server that sees everything, for example.
Yeah, this reminds me of contact tracing.
Yeah.
When sort of the pandemic broke out, there was sort of two worlds. There was this dystopian world where one government would put out an app that tracks everyone and knows all the interactions of every people. And there was sort of the utopian version of that a lot of academics were pushing for. And it's something like this, where you would disperse your scent. If you were positive, you could send out a signal, and those who picked up your scent would be alerted, but privately, like only they would know. So yeah, I'm curious to see where this goes, like what other sort of use cases we can find for this.
Yeah, that I think probably was the first kind of like wide scale deployment of something like this. And then the hiring thing we just talked about is very much kind of like also a proto version of the pheromone here, literally just being like, I want this job, Yeah, like I like thinking of it as basically just like a private manifestation kind of. It's like you kind of put out what you want for yourself, or like who you are and where you want to be. And you can sort of just discover matches and overlap. If this is to be something that is like fully akin to like natural pheromones, like chemical pheromones, I do think cryptography is the right substrate for it, in that it is like very neutral. It's very peer-to-peer. There's no dependence on a centralized server. Like, I think this is like one of the rare things where a TEE does not kind of fully subsume it, because it, I think, does fundamentally change the nature of something like this, where you do have to go through some service that is like providing this matching, versus it being like, yeah, literally my phone is letting out signals to the people around me, or like on an online platform, and they can just parse it. So yeah, I think this was a really fun kind of framing and wrapping for a lot of our technology that made it easier to explain and think about. And we actually picked it up at DWeb, Decentralized Web Camp in California, just from some conversations there with kind of more like peer-to-peer, local-first technology people.
Another concept that you've been very excited about is this idea of local-first hardware. So I think this is a great fit for digital pheromones, because these are kind of things that just need to be happening in the background. And you could run it on your phone, but the problem is Apple is very restrictive about the things you can do on a phone. That is just their philosophy. I think everyone who has developed on iPhone knows this, and they are one of the most fun products to use as a user, and one of the worst companies to deal with as a developer, as many people know. Yeah. Yep, exactly. So there's limits to what you can do with an iPhone with existing devices. But I think a really cool concept is having open hardware that like somehow is connected to your sensitive data, but keeps it securely on that hardware. And you can actually walk around, maybe wearing a pendant or something, that's just constantly sending out these signals to other people. And finding compatibility that way, just in your normal day-to-day life. And so I think that's a very like interesting area of exploration. If anyone is very knowledgeable about hardware and wants to work on this stuff, please let us know.
Cool.
So I think another concept that we introduced at ZK12 was narrowcasting, which essentially is like the opposite of broadcasting. You can basically pick like specific criteria that you want your message to be received by. And kind of the cryptographic version of this is that like literally it could only be decrypted by people that fit this criteria. So like witness encryption is kind of like the purest version of this, but you can build something with similar affordances using a mix of like ZK and MPC. Another related result to this that we published for the first time at ZK12 was a new scheme called Trinity, which was developed in-house, basically mixing like garbled circuits, Plonk, and then a very recent result using like KZG witness encryption. Really beautiful paper. Would recommend people to check it out. And yeah, like one really nice affordance is that you can build something like narrowcasting really easily, because it has really low rounds of interaction between, in this case, the two parties. this is like a general flaw of MPC. If you want to build apps with it, there's like usually a lot of back and forth, and it's pretty annoying for an app developer to deal with if you're trying to make a consumer app, just for the reason that people put their phones away. Like literally just like once the phone goes away, it just like no longer can respond to requests as easily. Like Apple exposes some things.
Was this part of the motivation for your server-aided MPC model?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Like that's another place where multi-party FHE shines is you can delegate a bunch of stuff to the server, and so you don't need to be online for those phases. But ultimately, it still has like about 4 rounds of back and forth interaction, because now you need to send something to the server needs to get back to you. You need to then do this decryption. Whereas Trinity is basically just 1 round of interaction. Like I basically just send like an encrypted email to somebody, and they can decrypt it if they match some criteria. And the other nice thing that Trinity adds in is actually verifiability of input. So this relates to, Nico, what you were talking about with catfishing. Like this is kind of a general problem with MPC is like, if the inputs aren't like verified or signed in some way, then you can basically say whatever you want, right? You can sort of like discover the other person's private information by just like repeatedly querying them. And so Trinity also basically adds a really like clean tie between like zero knowledge proofs, which can prove various like properties of your input data, and like a multi-party computation, which in this case is done with garbled circuits.
Cool. Moving on to your next events. Andrew, you and I jumped on a call after ZK12 and you were at Edge City. Were you running something similar to like ZooPass in Edge City, or what were you working on there?
I think, first off, shout out to Janine and Timur and the rest of the Edge City team for letting us do something throughout the whole month at their event.
Nice.
I think they were very gracious and kind and supporting all of the hitches along the way as we were developing this. At Edge City Lana, we built an app called Cursive Connections. And the idea was to better connect people within this specific sphere of Edge City Lana. Mm-hmm. And so some things were similar, related to people being able to form their own social graphs from NFC tapping, where everyone had a wristband. But some things were also different in that we had matching that was more specific to the Edge City community. So one big thing at Edge City was the Tensions game. I think Timber ran that. And the Tensions game was hot takes where you could fill out your opinion on these hot takes. And when you actually met someone, you would figure out whether or not you agreed on some of them, but more importantly, which ones you disagreed on. And within the Edge City community, this was a big topic of conversation. And another interesting experiment we tried out at Edge City was we wanted to see if we could match people within a specific event. So we chose the Halloween party that they were throwing, and we wanted people to be able to walk into a room, kind of upload their preferences here, and within the event basically find who was there that they might be compatible with or might want to spend more time with after the party.
Like a dating app? Was that a dating matching?
We framed it more as a friendship finding.
Okay.
But I think this could easily
but really it was dating.
dating app in certain contexts.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. We're just surfacing the connection, however far that takes you.
Cool.
And I think there are a few interesting takeaways here. Number one is just a very practical lesson of people don't want to take out their phones at events.
Oh, yeah.
And I think this is actually what inspired some of the hardware directions as well. The idea that you can just have hardware that's just like passively there that maybe lights up when you find connection, that would make much more sense at this kind of event as opposed to people needing to check out their phones. And another related learning, which I guess we'll talk about more, is specifically we wanted a lot of the computation to be non-interactive. So we wanted to be able to surface the matches directly within the event without people having to check their phones. And so this naturally surfaced the idea of using TEs, because the problem with multi-party FHE is you do have this interactive decryption step. So we thought of this example as one where you could enter a room and you understand that the data you share within that room or within that ephemeral context will go to secure hardware because it needs to match you non-interactively.
I was curious, actually, you just mentioned TEs. So far, most of the experiments have been purely cryptographic, purely like software mathematic. We have these hardware tools. Some trust them, some don't. They kind of fulfill a lot of the functionality we'd want to use cryptography for. And so my question is, as a design team, where do you draw the line between staying in pure cryptography or reaching out for the TEs?
Yeah, it's actually a question that we've grappled with a lot this past year. And there's a lot of different angles to look at it from. One angle is like funding. So we so far have been funded by privacy and scaling explorations at the Ethereum Foundation with grants. And so like they support programmable cryptography research. So a lot of our focus has been in that direction because that's the community and ecosystem we've been a part of. And it's been very synergistic in that way, in that we're able to take technology that's developed in-house and then find, like product-facing uses of it. And I think, yeah, as long as we're funded that way, it will always be a priority to explore this stuff. Another angle here is like user first. And I think like something that we have yet to identify internally, and as far as I can tell, also externally, is like when people care about using the full cryptographic version of something versus something like secure hardware. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter what like purist cryptographers think is correct. If you're trying to build stuff for people, it just matters what they think. At least if you want people to use your stuff. If you don't care, then I guess, make your perfect utopia, I guess. And I think like ultimately there's trade-offs to using this stuff. And I think there's like a common phrase that comes up in cryptography circles of like, oh, it's just dependent on math. And like, for some reason in this world, that's cool and makes sense. But I think for a lot of people, this is just intuition. Like that seems a lot less strong than just like, here's a really powerful box that like can't see your things. Like, I feel like that just clicks a bit better, or like, at least I could see it clicking better. And so, yeah, like one thing we definitely want to clarify more in 2025, both for ourselves and for the external community is like, yeah, when do people care? So running some experiments with TEs, running some stuff with pure MPC, and just getting some user data on like, how do you respond to the copy around this stuff? Because ultimately, an average person is not going to verify a TE attestation or like look at the verification key for this proof. They're completely trusting you and the sort of copy and explanation that you give them and like the sort of feeling the app elicits. So basically, like my answer is like to be determined what balance we're going to use for this. And we want it to just be very user driven versus like what we think is right. And yeah, excited to share with the community the findings we get there.
Yeah, super curious to see results.
Yeah, like I think a lot of people are either committing to one because they believe in it, but I think I've seen less of a kind of like, let's try them both and see what happens.
Yeah, one way I've been thinking about this is in terms of the hierarchy of trust when it comes to data privacy and ownership. So you can think about the lowest level of trust a user has in an application is one where the application just like makes no claims to keep your data private and just like blatantly will sell your data and everyone knows about it. The level that comes above that is one where the application is just like, trust me, bro. I know what I'm doing. I'm not going to like sell your data or anything. After that comes regulatory trust. An example here in a different topic is like licenses. Like people trust licenses because you can like eventually bring someone to a court of law if they violate the license. And at the end of the day, you like have trust in that system because of the regulatory mechanism that underlays it. And then one above that, I would put secure hardware, where you maybe don't have to trust the application developer as much if they do remote attestation, if they like open source their code and everything. But now you're trusting Intel, you're trusting like state actors to not break into this. Maybe you're trusting an $150,000 microscope or whatever the cost is for that. But then the top of that, or rather the second from the highest, is cryptography. This is like trust in math, and the real beauty of cryptography in the trust hierarchy is that you can verify it from first principles. Like Intel is closed source, like, or SGX, TDX, like, you can't go into every single layer of depth and check it yourself. But theoretically, you could do the same with MPC, with FHE, and actually go in and make sure everything checks out and that your data is safe. But
first principles plus a few degrees. But yes.
Yes. The more practical framing is that you trust a bunch of smart people with a lot of degrees to actually go in there and verify this and tell you, like, hey, it's good. Which is also why cryptography really just has to be paired with open source. If you can't go in and verify it, like, it kind of makes no sense to begin with. But there is like a sneaky, like, I don't know, it technically belongs in the top of the hierarchy, but it's like somewhat restricted to a certain design space, which is just local first. You can think about this in terms of LLMs processing your data. If an LLM wants to process your data and it's running entirely on your machine, like that is arguably like the highest level of trust. You can just turn your computer offline and you can just run everything locally, and that's great. But that's restricted to single player applications. Like, once you want to get into multi-party computation, then you have to do either cryptography or secure hardware. So I do think, like, the big open question from a user first perspective is what applications are best fit for which level of trust, and how do users actually perceive these things. And I think, to answer your question, cryptography is really important for very sensitive data, anything that might involve like medical data, anything that people really might not want to share with the server. I think that's where cryptography can really shine.
I want to talk about the last event of the year, I think, for you. I mean, if we just go back, 2024 sounds like it was just a marathon of events and activations for the two of you, for the group. But let's talk a little bit about DevCon and what you did there. There's like an art gallery. I remember you telling me about this before you did it. How did it go?
Yeah. Main new technical thing we did was collaboration with yet another guest on this show, the folks from Tetseo.
Oh, nice.
To essentially do a co-snark experiment. It's actually kind of a iteration of the ZK wrapped, kind of, in a way, where essentially we wanted people to be able to like prove to us that they'd hit some number of taps or connections at the event, again using NFC cards and this sort of thing to produce signatures. And we had a little prize store. Again, it was like NFC rings, we had like NFC bucket hats, we had bracelets, we had the whole lineup.
NFC bucket hats. I've never heard that.
NFC
That's
bucket
mad.
hats. Yeah. I think I have one somewhere. I got one of the last ones. It's just an NFC, like a cloth resistant NFC tag behind a label. It's actually really nice. And also setting up that clothing line was super fun. That was a collaboration with myself and Tessa, who is a contractor on our team. Anyway, we basically wanted people to make proofs for us that they hit some number of connections. And we want to experiment with delegating that. Again, actually in the same vein as like multi-party FHE, where you would love for, less of the computation to happen on your own device and for more of it to be kind of done somewhere else. And so, what people would do is they would take the signatures they collected, they would secret share it into 3 parts. And we did a fun thing where 3 different teams hosted the CoSnark servers.
Cool.
PSC hosted one of them, the PSC Infra team, shout out to them. Cursive hosted one of them. I am terrible at AWS. I messed up the deployment once or twice, so I was definitely the weakest link in the chain. But we hosted one, and then
Nice.
Tetseo hosted one. And together, there's some sort of theoretically we could all collude and see your signatures, but there's kind of a reputation level thing, which I think is really interesting, of we're all privacy focused teams. The chance that we do this is low, or at least it would kind of hurt our reputations if we did. And so, we basically did this whole delegated proving experiment, and it actually was oversubscribed. I think we had a few tens of thousands of proofs overall.
Nice.
And there's one point where
I think almost 20,000.
Wow.
across the whole event. And basically again, this is my fault, where we were supposed to replicate the nodes so that there could be more servers making proofs. And then not only did I not do this, but also like 2 of our nodes broke. So there's only 1 node on the Cursive side and then 8 for PSC and Tatseo. And so we're completely bottlenecked by Cursive. And then eventually we fixed it and it was fine. It cleared out the queue of proofs that was waiting. But
yeah, one of the coolest things about deploying things in the real world is that you get very direct feedback loops. And the way we had set it up was that you would make these proofs to show how many people you've met, and you could get some of this NFC merch by showing these proofs. And so we realized that the infrastructure for generaking co-snarks was not working when there were tens, if not 100 of angry people standing in front of our booth asking us why their number wasn't going up.
Oh no.
Yeah, that was a fun day.
I love that you put yourselves in this sort of line of fire. But it's just so it's also you get like the visceral feeling. I feel like after that you go back building and you take it in. You're not ignoring that feedback. I feel like it sticks with you.
No, I think we're really motivated by that as a team, like collecting it and also acting on it. We do a lot of just like ivory tower stuff as well. It's hard not to when you're trying to figure out what to do with this technology. But we try to like be on the ground as much as we can. And we really like every opportunity we get, we try to like make the most of it, reflect on it heavily, and just like move forward.
I mean, that's a huge number of events just there that we covered, testifying to what you're saying
and
now.
Yeah, again, huge shout out to Tatseo folks, Ash, Lucas, the other Lucas, Daniel, Roman, a bunch of amazing folks helped both with the activation, but also they just came to the booth and like helped volunteer and stuff. So such lovely folks.
Yeah. I guess that ties into the final part of our DevCon experience, which was the Cryptographic Connections Museum that we launched in collaboration with a bunch of artists and collaborators. And the idea behind the museum was just to showcase all the work that has gone into cryptography, help educate a lot of attendees who might not know much about cryptography and its history, and also tell people what's going on in the future and what to get excited about. And we basically got a bunch of artists and cryptographers and everything in between to showcase different pieces of work. And I think the most exciting part of the whole experience for me was that Ash had set up a display about the history of MPC. So she had all of these different fundamental papers. I remember the day before I had gone to a print shop in Thailand and gotten literally 500-600 pages of papers printed of just math. And they were so confused, like, what is going on here? And the whole display was just these papers and this history of MPC and a bunch of golden frames set up like an academic's desk, like a coffee mug, pen, paper, all that stuff. And throughout the event, this was super attractive to a lot of the museum guests. And 2 people, Jens Groth and Don Beaver, showed up. And they both had their own papers, Groth 16 and Beaver triples, on the table. And
cool.
That was so exciting seeing them walk over, get to pick up their own paper and be like, oh my God, this is so cool.
Yeah.
That was definitely the highlight of DevCon for me.
Amazing.
Nico actually was also a featured artist. Do you want to talk about the thing that we did together?
Hey.
Yeah. You guys printed out the ZK jargon decoder.
Yes. Actually, it was supposed to just be a museum piece and a prize, but we actually had 3 or 4 robberies. That was actually
they all got robbed. They all got stolen.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah. Pretty much all of them. I think we saved one for you, right? I hope you have yours.
Yes.
Okay, great.
It's right here.
Oh,
Wonderful.
cool.
Wonderful.
Nice.
The rest got stolen. So if you're out there listening to this, we will find you.
You weren't supposed to take them.
We know who you are.
Whoa. Wild. Okay, so that wrapped up, I guess, 2024 for you. When I spoke to you end of the year, you were like, I don't want to travel anymore. Although I think actually, Andrew, you kept traveling.
Yeah.
But we're now 2025, beginning of the year. What's the plan? Are we going to see you doing more activations at events? Are you actually planning on doing something else? You were talking about maybe a shift more towards product. So yeah, tell us what you're thinking.
Yeah, I think like specific technical directions are still being figured out, but like definitely, I think just in terms of like process of building, I think trying to shift more to marathon mode. I think last year was definitely a lot of sprints of like something comes up, it aligns enough with our directions. And I think we were just really in deep need of like data. Like we just needed to like try things with people who weren't already pilled. Sometimes like at a conference like ZK Summit, it's actually good to try it with people who are pilled just to educate more than like necessarily get user data. But something like DevCon leans much more in the other direction. And I think this year probably still will do some events and conferences just because they're convenient and we have good connections with them. But I think building products for specific personas and just trying to like grow within the cities that we live in and like just try to get like further and further away from like ZK Ethereum land. Because I think the sort of confounding factor in our space, which is both a blessing and a curse, is that like people are down to try technology for technology's sake. Like they're like, oh, cool thing in the tech, let me try it. Versus like, this like does something good for me. And most people operate entirely in the latter camp of like, oh my God, I don't want to have another app on my phone. I just only want it if it's going to like add to my life. So it's a little bit like high level, but just I think trying to get more feedback loops from people very outside of the space and like more targeted at like specific people. Like one example that comes to mind is like professional apps entirely. So at people, you know, who are like LinkedIn power users or something, like how can we make their kind of hiring job search experience even better? And just trying to build a very like focused application around that is like one example. I don't know if we'll end up doing that, but.
Cool. Are you looking for the product, like the singular product that you do end up building? Is that sort of what a lot of this was headed towards? Or do you actually see yourself having a suite of different, just more built out products?
I mean, we'll see. I'm excited to check back in like 6 months and let you know. But because we are in more of a like consumer and social area, like I think what tends to be the right process in this space is like lots of shots on goal and you see what sticks and then go deeper with that. So I have a sense that that's going to be at least like the short-term strategy is just building out lots of stuff, giving it an earnest experiment, and then trying to have a conclusive yes or no and just continue and understanding that most of them will be no's. And that is just kind of how it is.
Cool. I can't wait to see what comes out of this. I'm so excited for Cursive, actually. I really liked the approach like, from the start. And I want to see what next year brings.
Yeah, totally. And on the flip side, we're also always looking to collaborate with other teams on MPC, FHE research, any sort of technical research that might align with these directions. We've had many successful collaborations in the past with different teams, be it PSE, Gauss, ZK Email, a bunch of people doing really good work in the space. So if you are doing any technical explorations and you want to maybe see it integrated into applications, user-facing products, please do reach out to us.
Are you worried at all about like some of the patent stuff in the FHE world? Like, does that stress you out? Because you're touching FHE a lot. And I'm just wondering, like, are any of the libraries you're actually using potentially at risk because of the more extreme patenting and less open source nature of at least the way FHE seems to be developing?
I think for the time being, actually, like multi-party FHE is no longer a key part of our toolkit. Just like right now, there's a few bottlenecks, like in particular, like public key sizes are very large. It's a little bit slow. It's like a little bit hard to use. And I don't foresee that changing in the near future. Or at least we have a lot of other options that we have to explore more fully before we come back to it. So it isn't directly affecting us. We were talking earlier about how lovely it is that we're a big family and this feels like a certain, like, you know, warring faction just like decided to leave and make things harder.
Yeah.
And I hope they turn that around. Like, you know, as Andrew said, there's an understanding that we're not fighting each other. We're fighting like the rapidly encroaching, like centralized, zero privacy based world. And that's who we need to be focused against and not against each other. So it's easy to say that in theory, but I understand if you're trying to run a business, it can be easier to be like zero sum. I don't know.
Yeah, I do think this is a question of long-term trajectory. If you want developers to come to your ecosystem, if you want people to build upon the crypto systems you are building, I think open source is pretty imperative to that. Now, I don't claim to know the specifics about the licenses and the trade-offs there and what it means for business, but I do think, generally speaking, the more open, the better, at least in this early stage of development. Because the question is not which FHE system is going to win. It's whether FHE even stands a chance in the first place.
Yeah, good call. Well, thank you both for coming on the show, sharing with us the journey of Cursive, all of the activations and experiments, and the direction you see yourselves going. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. And also thanks for the 2 spotlights at ZK 11 and 12. Like, that's been so great for us. And also just, to, I think, build awareness and education for this technology has been inspiring for us. Like, it's really cool to see what cryptographers think of this.
Cool. Thanks, Nico, for joining this one.
Thanks for having me on.
And I want to say a big thank you to the podcast team, Rachel, Henrik, and Tanya, and to our listeners. Thanks for listening.